Last month, I was lucky to have got a chance to give a talk during the 63rd International Day for Military History, a conference that was organized by the German Army Center for Military History and Social Science. The conference was held at Potsdam, a beautiful city with a lot of military history behind it, and Potsdam is located very close to Berlin. The aim of the conference was to study the challenges faced and the changes that the armies the world over underwent during the interwar period, that is the period between 1919 and 1939. It was a treat to hear various learned speakers, and for me, it was indeed a once in a lifetime experience to see the professional manner and the efficiency with which a conference was organized by a German army institution. I would like to thank Professor Dr. Searle, a renowned German historian and who's also the academic director of the German Army Center for Military History and Social Science. I also want to thank Dr. Markus Pohlmann, who was the chief organizer of this conference, and Dr. John Zimmerman, the co-organizer of this conference, for firstly organizing this conference so very well and for giving me a chance to be part of this conference. I spoke on the subject challenges faced by the British Indian Army between the First and the Second World War. Before you hear my talk, in case you so wish, do subscribe to my channel. The name is Major General Thakur. Over to my talk. I start my talk by the mention of the second most important component of the British Empire, and that was Imperial India. We all know which was the most important component, the Britishizers. Imperial India in the beginning of 20th century was also called as the Greater India, and the British would proudly call it as the brightest gem in the British crown. Imperial India's British Indian Army contributed as many as 1.4 million troops for the First World War. And these numbers, 1.4 million, were equivalent in numbers to the combined strength that was provided by the wide dominions of the British Empire, that is the Canada, Australia, South Africa, and New Zealand. Out of this 1.4 million, 0.87 million were combatant. Indians fought in almost 5 theaters of the First World War. They fought in Western Front, where they fought in France and Belgium. They also fought against the Germans, and they fought against in the different other theaters of the war. In fact, in the British fight against the Turks was they could not have won without the support of the Indian Army. 68,000 Indians died in the First World War, and as many as were wounded. I think this is about 30% of the Romanian soldiers who died in the First World War. For their bravery, the Indian soldiers were awarded with 11 Victoria Crosses, which is the highest British military honor, and they were also awarded 99 military crosses. India's contribution to the First World War was not only in terms of men, but also in terms of material. And India gave a significant contribution in terms of supplies, ordnance. And in terms of money, the India's contribution to the First World War was 146 million pounds. India provided almost about 15% of the total British efforts for the First World War. And it helped the British Empire to fight and to come out of its one of the most severe challenges in military history. With this as the background to my presentation, I will cover my presentation in 4 parts: the challenges which were faced by the British Indian Army, the changes which took place in the interwar period, the process of mutual perception, because from the conference advertisement, I saw the 2 points of focus were on the process of mutual perception and also on the importance of forecasting. Coming to part 1, challenges faced by the British Indian Army. Basically there are three challenges I'm going to talk about. The first challenge was the volatile political environment. The entire country at that point of time was fighting for freedom. There were nationalists moving in and out of jail. There were several roundtable conferences that were held in London to basically to understand the demands of the Indians, and more, in fact, they were more focused on gaining time and delaying the process. And there were nationalists who were demanding self-government, like the other white dominions. In addition, outside the country, Indian revolutionaries were actively working in USA. They were working in France, working in Germany, and there were various Germans who were also lobbying with Indians to rise against the British Empire. The second challenge that I want to highlight is the apolitical nature of the Indian Army. We heard about this army being apolitical. The historically, the Indian Army has been always isolated from politics, and emphasis was on the loyalty of the army to the king emperor, to the state. And as the officers were kept themselves away from politics, the men also followed the same. And I would say that some call it as a conspiracy, but whatever it was, this apolitical nature of the Indian Army delayed the process of freedom for India by another 3 decades. I mean, from the end of First War onwards. The third challenge that I want to talk about, which was there, was in the minds of the Indian Army soldiers, and that was a challenge to their own, I would say, inner furum, as to what should they do. Should they be loyal to the British Empire, or should they be loyal to the cause of freedom, or to their own Indians who were fighting for self-government? And to answer this question, I researched various regimental histories of basically the Gurkha regiments, the Sikh regiments, the Garhwali regiments, because these were the regiments of the Indian Army that have been there for last 200 years. And all that I could find was that they're just mentioning about various ceremonial events like parades and tournaments and things of that kind, but not a single mention about the political environment in the country. However, the answer I got it from the researching other sources, and what I could gather was that overall, I can say that there were intermittent currents of this nationalist feeling, isolated incidents, but there was no major mutiny, there was no major incidents against the British Empire as far as the British Indian Army was concerned. The soldier just followed his what he was told by the officer, and he just followed the traditions that were laid down for his regiment. There were two mutinies, but these were small ones, and these were not directly related to the cause of freedom. There was a mutiny in Rangoon, 137 Baluch Regiment. There was a mutiny in Singapore by 5th Light Infantry. In fact, in that mutiny, there were about 37 Indians who were publicly executed. But overall, I would say that this was a period where the Indian Army remained steadfast to its traditions of the regiments. I now come to part 2, which is the changes which took place in the British Indian Army during this interwar period. Two things I want to highlight: that the Britishers made sure their two guiding, I would say, principles was, firstly, they wanted the Indian Army to continue to serve the imperial interest, to continue to serve the cause of the British Empire. That was one. And the second, another important underlying reason was that the British wanted to retain control over the Indian Army, and that is the officer cadre. There was huge demand by the Indians, by the Indian leaders, that the officer cadre should be Indianized, and but this is what they always feared, because way back in 1857, the Great Indian Mutiny, which is a different subject altogether, in that mutiny there were 69 out of 71 regiments of Bengal Presidency which had revolted against the British and caused, I would say, a total confusion. And in the initial 4 or 5 days, there was there were senior officers in the British East India Company who, I would say, they could not even decide as to how to tackle with this problem. So this is what they wanted to avoid, and this change they just dragged their feet. The overall strength of the Indian Army was reduced from more than 500,000 to what was there after the end of the World War, to 140,000. And there were certain changes, regrouping of the there were reduction and regrouping of the cavalry regiments and also of the infantry regiments. 39 cavalry regiments, there were 7 cavalry regiments which were disbanded, and then they were grouped. And similarly, the infantry regiments, out of 138 infantry battalions, 13 were disbanded, 125, the remaining, they were grouped into regiments, and each regiment had between 5 to 10 battalions. So this regrouping was done, so that each regiment had a regimental center where it could take care of the administrative issues of the battalions that were under it. I continue with the changes. 3 categories of troops were created: one for the frontier duties, one for the offensive operations, and the last one for the imperial duties, internal defense. And there were certain corps which were reorganized and raised. That is the Corps of Signals, that is basically for communication, Corps of Supply, Ordnance, and Veterinary Corps for the management of animals. And as I said, the Indianization of the officer cadre, they went very slow, and there was the establishment of the Prince of Wales Royal Indian Military College, which was set up in Dehradun. This was basically for training of young men who could be trained for 5-6 years, and then for preparing them for commission in the Indian Army. Indian Military Academy was started in 1932 for a proper formal training of the Indians to as Indian commissioned officers. I would like to once again, the last change that I would like to highlight is that in the minds of the soldiers of the British Indian Army, there was a weakening of the bond between the soldier and the officer. And this is because of the experiences, this is because of the, I would say, they felt let down by the British Indian Army after the end of First World War, that when the British were dragging their feet and not taking any decisive steps towards giving self-government or empowering the Indians. I now come to the part 3, that is the process of mutual perception. First perception that I want to talk about is the British held that typical racial view that Indians could not be employed for operations outside the Indian theater in the European theater of war. So as a result of which, there were no plans that were made for employment of Indian troops in the European theater. There were no contingency plans, and basically I've already said that the Indian Army was basically meant to fight on the border and for the internal security. And in fact, few Britishers also maintained this idea that Indian troops did not have martial traits. And this was grossly this was proved wrong when the war actually happened, as I have already stated in front of you. Second perception that I want to talk about is, what did British perceive about the Indians' wholehearted support to go for war? I'm talking about the First World War. Mahatma Gandhi was kind of supporting, telling every Indian that you must fight the war. And he was of the idealist view that when the king is under threat, or when he has a problem, we should not strike our authority at that point of time. And but there were Indians who were of the view that it is the duty of the slave to fight for his freedom, and they were of the view that this opportunity of British Empire being under threat must be exploited to gain freedom. But however, the perception of Mahatma Gandhi prevailed, and uh, Indian leaders asked their masses to participate in the war, and as a result of which, as I said, that almost about 1.5 million Indians were recruited, and without any plans, without adequate clothing, without any experience, they participated in this war. They fought against an enemy whom they had no idea about. They did not know why they were fighting. They were fighting in a terrain which was totally unfamiliar to them. They crossed oceans uh, when, in spite of the fact that their religion said that uh, it was considered in amongst Hindus and amongst Gurkhas that if someone who crossed the oceans would be violating his faith, and there were in fact special ceremonies to be held once he got back to be accepted back in the society. What did the British think about it? The British thought that Indians were fighting not for any goodwill or any good gesture. They thought that the Indians were fighting because they were worried that in case Britain loses to Germany, the Germans would invade India, and so they were fighting for their own selves. They were fighting for their home defense. And lastly, I would also say that after the victory in the First World War, there was also a certain kind of arrogance which came in the British minds, and uh, the British refused to get back to the war period, because there were many changes which had taken place during the war, social political changes, promises made by the Britishers, and but they just wanted Indians to forget that period of the First World War and get back to what they were before the war started. I want to add that the British perception about their own selves and about Indians was finally broken during the First World War. And in fact, the Indian contribution surpassed their expectations. And uh, this First World War actually helped in establishing India as a fighting race, and Indians acquired greater acceptability outside India also, and British were now under pressure to show to the world that they were involving Indians in their own affairs. What was the perception about in the minds of Indians about the British after the First World War? As I have already stated, Mahatma Gandhi himself was personally going to villages and making speeches and recruiting people, telling Indians that fight the war, go and participate in the war. But after the war, when in fact the British immediately after the war, they try to become more strict. They introduced certain sedition laws. They brought in certain acts where their intention was to suppress Indians further. And that is the time Indians realized that the British did not mean business as far as giving freedom to India was concerned. And from now onwards, I would say that the Indians started treating Britain with a lot of suspicion, and they knew that they will have to fight to gain independence. Lastly, what did Germans perceive about the British? Uh, well, uh, I have read. This is what I have read in certain books. So I'm right. I'm stating it here that the Germans were of the view that maybe the British were so engrossed in commercial activities that they would not be able to fight, or even if they fight, their empire will rise against them. And this is the book Germany and the Next War, General Friedrich von Bernhardi, in which he has stated that the combination of the Islamic forces and also the Bengali revolutionaries will lead to a situation which will destabilize the British Empire. Last part of the presentation is about legitimization and delegitimization of the war. Uh, well, uh, when the British Empire went to war, uh, Indians also, we also went to war. But the fact remains that uh, if we leave aside the legality of it, the question still remains in my mind and in the minds of many people that so many millions of Indians went to war against an enemy which was actually not their enemy, in a terrain, in an area which they were totally not familiar and which they had never planned to be there. To conclude, I will say that the period between the two world wars was a period which was very challenging. It was remarkable, and I would say to some extent it was a progressive period for the Indian Army. The Indian Army largely stood firm on its tradition, and in spite of the hectic political activities happening at that point of time, and there were many changes which happened in the Indian Army in terms of the reduction of the units, in terms of reorganization, and in terms of establishment of the training infrastructure which was done, and however the Indianization of the officer cadre was done to a very limited extent. Uh, by 1947, the year we got independence, just about 25% of the total officer cadre was Indianized. And lastly, I would like to say that uh, because of the Indian Army's contribution in the First World War and also in the Second World War, which is beyond the scope of this conference, Indian Army's contribution was a facilitator to India gaining independence in 1947. In the end, I would like to thank the German Center for Military History and Social Science for giving me this chance to come and share my thoughts. And thank you, Herr Sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, Scott Coleman. And thank you. I also want to thank the others who were behind the scenes, Pascal and photographer and the translators who have been, uh, done such a good job. And because I myself heard the translation being done, it was very useful. Thank you very much.